Well, I've always liked the monster within idea. I like the zombies being us. It's like zombies are the blue-collar monsters.
Alright, George Romero. You know him, you love him. He's had one of the most successful careers out of any filmmaker in Hollywood, and he's one of those people where even if you haven't seen his movies, you've probably still heard of him. And even if you don't know his name, you definitely know his influence. Stories about the undead have been around for centuries, but the idea of them being cannibalistic monsters that can kill you or turn you into them by biting you, that's something uniquely Romero and did not exist before him. But you've probably heard all about the films Romero made that actually got made, but I don't even think big fans of his realize just how many Romero films almost came to be, but for one reason or another, never were. So, let's talk about them. Easily George Romero's most ambitious film comes from his one-time contract with Marvel. And it's really weird to think that George Romero had a time where he almost made a superhero movie based on his own OC, but that's basically what happened. Copperhead is this guy. He's a cyborg sheriff living in a future Philadelphia, and he takes on street thugs and ninjas and giant robots. And I know all this sounds a lot like RoboCop, but George Romero was pitching this idea years before that movie. And just like Creepshow, Marvel and Romero wanted this movie to look as much like a living comic book as possible.
And said, you know, we have this character and I think it has a lot of potential. He said, I'd like you to try to develop a screenplay or something that we could do on film with this character. And the character was called Copperhead.
George wanted us to create storyboards in comic form. So, because he wanted the movie to look like a Marvel comic.
Marvel was really impressed with the script, but at the time, they didn't have the funding necessary to properly finance the film. Especially with a lot of the effects and ideas that Romero had pitched, they just simply didn't have the funds to properly invest in the film. It was left on the back burner where it still resides to this day.
Marvel didn't have the power to get it financed. We didn't have the power to get it financed. And it just sort of went by the wayside.
Stephen King and George Romero apparently hit it off great after making Creepshow together. So much so that George Romero had 3 different deals going at one point to adapt stories from Stephen King. And yes, George Romero was Stephen King's first choice to direct Pet Sematary. Stephen King, who wrote the immediate bestseller in 1983, and owned sole rights to Pet Sematary in 1984, had met with George Romero to discuss making the film. And Stephen King and George Romero already had a great relationship at this point, as I already mentioned that they both worked in the horror movie Creepshow. And Romero at this point was already working with Stephen King to develop 2 different books, which is both The Stand and Salem's Lot, both of which later got adapted without any help from Romero. Stephen King was very happy to have Romero direct the film on 2 specific conditions. 1, Stephen King had to write the screenplay, and 2, the film had to be shot in Maine. Romero said deal, and he bought the rights to make the film from Stephen King for $10,000. Well, 4 years went by, and stunningly, studios were pretty hesitant to adapt the film, worried that Stephen King's success was just a fluke and wouldn't be enough to get horror fan bookworms in the theater seats. See, Stephen King was still popular at this point, but he wasn't the household name like he is today, and he certainly hadn't proved box office success at this point. However, with the 1988 writer's strike, studios needed to get quick interest in stories that they maybe weren't too keen on earlier. And in 1988, Paramount acquired the rights to the film. But those 4 years had changed a lot, including Romero's interests at the time. He had a script he was proud of, but he had also begun to work on a different horror movie. In those 4 years, George had struck a deal to direct another horror movie with a different company, Orion Pictures, an adaptation of Michael Stewart's book Monkey Shines. George left the project to finish work on Monkey Shines, and King, who under contract had final say over who would direct the film, chose Mary Lambert instead, who finally finished the Pet Sematary movie that we know released in 1989. Stephen King and George Romero had also agreed to adapt one of Stephen King's lengthier novels, The Stand. King was originally surprised that Romero was interested in making The Stand a feature film, saying, quote, "I guess I never really considered The Stand as a movie, seriously. Then George and Richard came up, they were out in Hollywood after doing Dawn of the Dead and talking to people." End quote. But once again, things fell into problems. During development, George Romero had left Laurel Entertainment, the company that was making The Stand, and although the reason has never been confirmed, it's likely over some form of financial decision. George Romero had also written an over 200-page script filled with gore that went well over the PG-13 rating that the studios wanted. Hilariously, though, after Romero left, Laurel Entertainment struck a deal with ABC to make the miniseries using Romero's original script. I mean, a bunch of altercations were made to make the final cut more TV-friendly, but yeah, they went with this script. Alright, one last Stephen King could have been. It. George Romero had been the original director and attached to direct the miniseries of It. And just like The Stand, it's a much lengthier novel by Stephen King, and George really wanted to adapt that part. Working with his co-writer Lawrence D. Cohen, George Romero wrote 10 episodes of an It miniseries, each 1 hour long, making it a 10-hour-long It adaptation that would have aired over 5 nights. ABC was pretty uneasy about running 10 hours of It, and just like The Stand, they took issue with how gruesome the script Romero wrote was. Refusing to shorten the length or take out the gore, Romero told ABC to find another director. Romero left the project in 1990 to focus on the remake of his 1968 film, Night of the Living Dead. In his place, ABC hired Tommy Lee Wallace, the director of Halloween 3 Season of the Witch. And finally, in fall 1990, it aired on ABC. The final product's a little over 3 hours long, and just enough blood and gore to still have a TV-14 rating.
Hello, I'm R.L. Stine. I write the Goosebumps books. Welcome to Dead House. I think you're going to like your new house.
R.L. Stine and George Romero feel like a weird matchup, but at one point it was gonna happen. In the 90s, when R.L. Stine's Goosebumps books were selling out at their highest peak, Romero was attached to write and direct an adaptation of the very first Goosebumps book, Welcome to Dead House, for 20th Century Fox. George Romero was really interested in the idea of making a horror film for all ages, and he mentions it in a letter to Fox Family's vice president at the time, Kevin Bannerman. He says, quote, "Horror for a young audience, and the fact that someone is willing to take it seriously, seems not only too good to be true and a genre I would love to contribute, but also a genre which the aforementioned checkbook types might be willing to see as not too big a stretch for me." End quote. Although it was originally slated to premiere on Halloween 1996, problems began to arise in development. George Romero had finished a first draft of the screenplay for Welcome to Dead House that neither R.L. Stine nor the studio were happy with. Okay, now to understand this, you have to at least be somewhat familiar with the first Goosebumps book, so let me give you a quick refresher. Welcome to Dead House is about two kids, Josh and Amanda, who move into a bizarre town called Dark Falls with strange residents. As the book goes on, they learn that the entire town is secretly zombies, and that they've been that way from a strange yellow gas that leaked out of a nearby factory that turned them all into the living dead. The biggest one is the much heavier critique of capitalism that Romero introduced into the story. Whereas in the original story, the creepiness of the town is sorta symbolic of feeling uncomfortable in a new place, Romero's version of Dark Falls is a massive industrial company town. And instead of an accidental gas that turns the town into zombies, the wealthy elite of the town have been purposefully and slowly transforming the population into zombies, as it makes them much more obedient workers. Whereas the original ghouls in R.L. Stine's book want to eat Josh and Amanda and drink their blood to sustain their own lives, in Romero's version, an evil CEO uses his army of ghouls to try to turn Josh and Amanda into another two cogs in a giant exploitive machine. Apparently the script was a little too real for the executives at 20th Century Fox. R.L. Stine really wasn't a big fan of the script either, and he was much more interested in having Tim Burton direct the project, whom the studio was also in talks with at the time. Eventually, they showed George the door and signed on with Tim Burton instead. And although that was probably a bad choice, since later Tim Burton left the project to direct an adaptation of Superman called Superman Lives, which also never ended up happening, by the way. But hey, if there is a silver lining in this story, it's that the Welcome to Deadhouse script is still out there, and you can theoretically still read it. In 2019, it was acquired by the University of Pittsburgh, and their library system currently holds the only known copy of the script. I don't know if they just let random people come in and read or not, but hey, if you're in the area, you could ask really nicely. Alright, we got one more project to talk about, and yeah, this is the big one.
Resident Evil.
First of all, the second that the Resident Evil movie got incepted, Sony Pictures, Capcom, and the very creators of Resident Evil wanted George Romero to direct, and it's obvious why. Romero's films are such an obvious influence on Resident Evil, and even Resident Evil creator Shinji Mikami has gone on and on about what a big fan he is of George Romero, and how much Night of the Living Dead inspired the Resident Evil series. Romero is a pretty big fan of Resident Evil 2, saying in 2013, "I think the zombie has become popular because of Resident Evil, and because of House of Dead, and because of video games more than anything else." Execs also thought attaching Romero to the project was a way to draw in horror fans who maybe didn't have big opinions of video game movies. George had even been hired previously by Capcom to direct this Resident Evil 2 commercial, and these shots alone are all the appetizer you need. Romero was hired to write and direct in 1998, and everything was looking like a match made in heaven. I mean, dorks were deciding online which horror actors they think were gonna get casted, and GameSpot was writing bullshit articles talking about every little rumor they hear about the upcoming film. It was already looking like Resident Evil was gonna be the next big blockbuster. And then the other shoe dropped. George Romero finished the script 2 months after he got hired, and it's incredibly faithful to the original video game. Its main characters are still Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine, who are both part of an elite police force called STARS. They both get called in to investigate some bizarre, gruesome murders out in the woods, and they're quickly outnumbered. They barricade themselves in a seemingly abandoned mansion. As the two of them explore the mansion, they start to learn it was at one point the base of operations for a giant pharmaceutical company called Umbrella Corporation. They learn that Umbrella was experimenting with biochemical and biological weaponry, that the zombies and monsters in the area are the result of those experiments, and that it's all about to threaten the world. All of these plot points in the game are in George Romero's script, and he even has scenes for the giant snake and man-eating plant from the game as well. It's also said that George wanted to keep a lot of the angles from the fixed camera of the game in mind while he was making the shot list. I didn't find a really great source for that, so take it as you will. But it's no doubt George wanted to keep the film full of the gory horror that's such a staple of the games. Now, stories of what happened next kind of differ, but by mid-1999, people got the sense that development was falling apart. In a Chicago Tribune interview, Romero said he was being as held in the dark about the future of the project as anyone else. And at E3 that year, Capcom producer Yoshiki Akamoto said his script wasn't good, so Romero was fired. This was some pretty upsetting news to fans. And I mean, you know it's bad when IGN has to start writing damage control articles to keep people interested. Like this one, where an anonymous insider source tells IGN that Romero's script lacked the feel of Resident Evil, and that Romero wanted to add in a ton of weird shit, like zombies with sunglasses and other goofy stuff that just didn't fit in at all. Either way, Romero was off the project, and got replaced by this schmuck who made the 2002 Resident Evil film that everyone, ironically, said lacked the feel of Resident Evil. Oh, and by the way, since then, the Romero script has been leaked. Like, it's online, you can read it. And weirdly enough, not only is it viciously like the original game, but there's no scene of zombies with sunglasses anywhere. I'm sure that anonymous IGN source totally existed, and they weren't just being paid shills. Just a coincidence that they got it backwards. Regardless, the crossover of the century was over, and Romero's Resident Evil was never to be. Now, I'm not saying all this to hit down on a dead guy. The reality is, George Romero had a successful career that few people in Hollywood can ever dream to accomplish. But it's just fun to look over at what might have been.